Hey, Cody Libolt here. So we've been trying to go on Facebook Live for like the last 20 minutes. It wasn't working from our page, but I'm going to try it from my profile. And I'm going to bring Jacob Brunton on. That's the tricky part, is bringing on somebody else. So we're going to be talking about the topic of racism and schism. Sad thing is that the discussion these days in our country, in the national politics as well as in church politics, is toward this concept of characterizing the United States history as so overwhelmingly racist that it has redounded and affected today, and that systemic racism is causing such problems that we are required. Hey, Jacob,
Hey,
good to see you on there. It's causing such problems that we are required to set up. Jacob, you're gonna have to turn it the other way.
why don't you
Sorry.
turn yours the other way? I'm
And
kidding. I'm kidding.
yeah, it doesn't. It won't. So
No, 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 no.
if you
This is
want to, we
good.
can start over,
This is
and
good.
I
I
can
was
I
kidding.
can I can turn it sideways. Okay. I realized it's probably better
Yeah.
to do it the other way, but let's just leave it this way for now. So the video we're going to discuss the schism in the church, the schism that is going to be caused by leftism coming out of entities like Christianity Today, the ERLC, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, Nine Marks, and Together for the Gospel, and um, together. Did I say the Gospel Coalition? Um, they are all on this trajectory toward full-on leftism. So, Jacob, you said this would be a good topic. What made you think this would be an important and
Well,
worthy
it's kind
topic for
of
today?
the hot topic right now within evangelicalism, and rightly so. I think more attention needs to be put on this, and more people need to be talking about it, not fewer. And unfortunately, there's a lot of sort of mushy middle people who are trying to say, let's calm things down. Let's not talk about this so much. Let's try to focus on other things. But you've got to focus on where the battle is, and this is where the battle is, particularly around the issues of race, racism, white supremacy. What do those words mean? How are they being redefined? How is the church starting to adopt a secular worldview uh, in order to redefine those things, and then how is that being used in a way that divides the church? That's what we're talking about, and that's what the church needs to be talking about right now. That's what people like Al Mohler and John Piper and Ligon Duncan and John MacArthur aren't talking about as much as they ought to be talking about. And unfortunately, this is really just going on Twitter, so to speak, or on social media. But that's the only place to be talking about this right now, other than on blogs and things like that. And so that's what we're working on. We're trying to bring more awareness to this, and to be part of the conversation. Because as much as that term or that phrase gets overused, I think it's important to have this conversation. But we need to be honest when we do it. And too many honest people aren't taking part of this conversation because they think it's a waste of time, but it's not.
Or they don't know how to
Yeah.
say anything productive.
So,
So let's catch the listeners up to speed as far as things that have happened in the last week or two that provoked us to want to talk about this out of all the things we could talk about. So there was an article by Joe Carter recently. There's been articles by Doug Wilson, Andrew Sandlin, Jordan Hall. There's been a lot of articles that are fighting with each other about this leftism. Is leftism really taking over in the ERLC slash TGC, which are basically one super parachurch organization at this point. If you look at who's on the board of each, and it's a clique of some 50 or so parachicks that have come to dominate, and they were characterized in an article I saw today at Sovereign Nations. They were characterized as the state theologians. I don't know if you got the chance to see that article, Jacob, but it is good. It was an anonymously written article published at sovereignnations.com, and it was saying that somebody like Jonathan Leeman or Russell Moore or many others like that, he lists them, which is kind of cool. They are functioning in such a way as to tell Christians you don't need to be fighting a culture war. And you are threatening the principalities and powers of this world just by your being a faithful witness as a Christian. And your faithful witness does not consist of winning any political battles. And so they're functioning basically as ambassadors from the secular world to the church, and they're telling us that we don't need to fight, and they're actually teaching us to stop fighting. But then they trick us into thinking that they're ambassadors from us to the world, but they're not. Anyway, so that's the essence of that article, and I just love the idea of calling them state theologians. They're basically theologians that, whether they know it or not, they have been co-opted by the agenda of the
Yeah,
secular state.
and that's a big part of this conversation is whether these people know it or not, whether it's intended. And I don't think that we really need to parse that out too much. Whether they know it or not is sort of immaterial. I mean, God obviously cares about that, and these people's pastors should care about that. But for the rest of us, the results are the same, whether they know it or not. Whether it's through ignorance or malice, the results are the same. The telos, or the end of these ideas, are the same, and they're all dangerous and divisive, and that's what we need to be addressing. We don't need to speculate overly much about intentions and motives so much as we need to identify what is the telos, what is the objective end, what is going to be the outcome of this, whether anybody means it or not.
So we've identified some of the organizations that we are at odds with. Now, let's just put it on the table. What is it that we're at odds with them about? What are the ideas that we're concerned about?
So one of the biggest things right now, and this is sort of the main topic that we want to talk about in terms of racism, is what is racism? What is white supremacy? And why is it bad? Why is it immoral? Right? Most people agree that racism and white supremacy are horrible evils. But you have to stop and ask yourself why. The word means something to most people that makes it such a horrible evil. It's because it denies something about the image of God in every human being. It denies something about the fact that all people, regardless of their supposed race, regardless of their skin color, regardless of their biological lineage, are created equally in the image of God and ought to be judged by their character rather than by their skin color or their biological lineage. Right? That's the truth that's being warred against in actual racism and also in actual white supremacy. But that's the truth that's being ignored or evaded in the contemporary redefinitions of those terms of racism and white supremacy. And those redefinitions are coming from the secular academy in what the academy calls critical race theory or critical theory, what a lot of conservatives have sort of loosely labeled cultural Marxism, and Joe Carter wrote a big article about that. It doesn't have to go by that name. It can go by the name critical theory. It can go by any name. Really, whenever we give it a name, it's just our attempt to nail down this evasive ideology that all of these people, including all of these Christians, are suddenly buying into. And it's just the ideology that says that it's white supremacy for a white person to go to opening night of Black Panther, that it's white supremacy to vote against welfare, that it's white supremacy to vote for Trump in and of itself. All of these things are now considered racism or white supremacy that have no business being categorized under that label, at least if we're going to maintain the same moral weight behind that label that has traditionally been assigned to it. And so whenever we object to this and whenever we try to label it, whether we call it cultural Marxism or critical race theory or neo-Marxism or whatever the case is, we're just trying to nail it down. We're trying to say, hey, there's this ideology that's coming in from the secular academy that is antithetical to what most people mean when they use these words. It's causing division in the church. It's leading to a lot of bad motives and a lot of false accusations against brothers and sisters in Christ. We want to try to identify it, name it, so that we can oppose it, right? So we try to grope for a name, and cultural Marxism seems like a decent name because it's a form of Marxism that's applied to cultural issues. But if someone doesn't like that, okay, fine, we'll call it critical race theory because it's sort of rooted in this academic stuff that's called critical race theory. But even that they object to. Jamar Tisby wrote an article that was published by the Washington Post where he basically said, oh, those people who don't care about racism, those Christians who don't care about racism, they're just going to say that I'm a critical race theorist. So already you've got people, including Christians, writing off that label. And the point is, they don't want to be labeled. They refuse to be labeled because that which can be labeled can be refuted. And they're trying to be evasive. They're trying to pretend that they aren't buying into and smuggling in this new secular ideology.
There is a system of legitimizing that takes place, and you can characterize it by this. Somebody like Ekemini Uwan stands on a stage and she says that whiteness is wickedness. And then somebody else, like Beth Moore, says, that was a decent presentation, or Thabiti Anyabwile says that was a decent presentation. There was something good about it. And then somebody like Russell Moore or Jonathan Lehman or those kind of guys that are maybe well respected within institutions within Southern Baptist life, they legitimize Beth Moore. Or and you can see where what happens is there's this chain of legitimizing where very often the complaints that we have, and when we talk about trajectory of bad ideas, we're saying, why is it that our institutions are platforming people that are praising all of these other
Yep.
people who are saying all these terrible things? And it begins, people look at you and they say, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. And we're like, well, do you care
Yeah,
about the
no,
truth?
Kevin Yuan should have been anathema after what she said at the Sparrow Conference and the way she said it, and then especially her follow-up. Her follow-up didn't help clarify. It didn't help to lessen division. It brought more division. It revealed a very fleshly, wicked temperament in her against those who rightly disagree with her ideology. And yet she was invited to speak at the Just Gospel Conference, where J.D. Greer, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, also spoke. So the president of the SBC was sharing a stage with this woman who is preaching this vile secular ideology that's causing division in the church in ways that it's obvious, right? And then Thabiti Anyabwile praised her talk. He encouraged her to keep on going in spite of her detractors. That article that was written about her talk, which echoed a lot of her same sentiments, Thabiti Anyabwile praised that as excellent, even poetic. Jemar Tisby published the article. Jemar Tisby interviewed Uwan afterwards and agreed with everything she had to say. He also interviewed Ali Henney, and together Ali Henney and Jemar Tisby talked about the new definition, the evolving definition of racism, which to them includes things like going to Black Panther as a white person opening night, voting against welfare, things like that. All of these people are being propped up by these evangelical institutions, by Together for the Gospel, by the Gospel Coalition, by the conferences. Jemar Tisby is arguably one of the most, if not the most, next to Thabiti Anyabwile. Those two are probably the most predominantly read voices on quote-unquote racial reconciliation within the church today. If any pastor is talking about racial reconciliation today, it's very, very likely that they are talking about ideas that they're getting from Anyabwile and Tisby, at the very least, if not also people like Uwan, right? And all of this is smuggling in this ideology of critical race theory. And you can follow Neil Shenvi on Twitter or look up his articles. He's got some amazing resources uncovering and sort of dissecting the academic side of critical race theory and how it's being smuggled into the church. And he does it in a very balanced, even-handed way, which I appreciate. But if he's right, then certain moral conclusions need to be drawn. If Neil Shenvi's right in his articles about the fact that Tisby and Anyabwile and Uwan and all of these other Christian leaders of racial reconciliation, if all of these people are buying into this secular ideology of critical race theory, and that's what they mean when they talk about racial reconciliation, then there's a lot of problems with it that the church needs to be standing up against. And yet these people who are supposed to be the gatekeepers of orthodoxy and the gatekeepers of true orthodox teaching within the church are platforming these people rather than calling them out like they should be.
So let's list out some of the problems that we are aware of that are being caused by this. I'll start with this one. At the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary yesterday, I believe, they had a job fair or something like that. It was a job fair specifically for students that were wanting to find jobs on campus working for the seminary. And you had to actually you had to fill out, or I'm pretty sure you had to fill out papers or something before you could go, but they were only inviting people that were of color. If you were not, quote, of color, a person of color, then you were not allowed to go to that job fair. In other words, it's an affirmative action policy, and they're being secretive about it. But if you were to call the school and ask them, they didn't say it on their website, but if you were to call them and ask them, especially, if you, like a couple of people sneakily called them and said, I'd like to go to the event, but they were just reporters. So there were things like that. And this is the kind of thing that you see at the seminary that John Piper
Yeah,
created.
yeah,
What is it,
Bethlehem
the
College and
seminary
Seminary.
you went there?
I'm a graduate from there. I got my undergrad in theology from there.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
they've got a scholarship now that's explicitly for people of color. It's a discriminatory scholarship against anybody who is white, which is really, really disappointing to me because when I went there, I always imagined getting to a point in my life and in my ministry where I would be able to support BCS as an alumni or as an alumnus. And now I don't want to do that. I have no desire to support them if they're going to be implementing discriminatory scholarships like that. And I would have the same reaction if it was discrimination in the other direction. If it was only for white students or only for Asian students or only for Latino students, regardless of what it is, I loathe discrimination, and so should every other Christian in any context. Yes,
Racial
yes,
discrimination.
obviously.
So there's other ones too. I was at a church in Oregon and I watched a video, because it was a church of like 600, 700 people. And there was a video playing on the screen. And the video was by Pastor Eric Mason. And he was explaining why we need to open up our hearts to the idea of specifically funding pastors of color, to train them and to put them in inner cities, because um, apparently there's a need for that. There's a need for pastors of a certain color. And, when I saw that, I was like, that's very concerning to me. So I learned more about Eric Mason, and it turns out he has a woke church book. And the book has some okay things, and it has a lot of bad things. You can hear the review of woke church at the channel of AD Robles, youtube.com/AD_Robles. And, he's done a lot of reviews of the kinds of intellectual material coming out of this movement. From Ray Ortland is an important one. And, we didn't mention Anthony Bradley yet. He's an important thinker in this area. And there's this movement toward not only affirmative action within churches, but also acceptance of voting Democrat. And that's a major concern to me when I hear Mark Dever and Jonathan Lehman standing on stage together saying, you know what, there are Democrat voters in my church. And it's not a sin for them to do that. The reason they do that is because, it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off between, the Republicans have the good morals sometimes, but then the Democrats, they're really into good social programs. And that perspective is so crazy because the only thing the Republicans sometimes get right is that we ought to have smaller government. And the Democrats don't ever get anything right. Their social programs are wicked. So, to me, it's an obvious matter of church discipline if you have somebody in your church that's voting for a pro-abortion candidate, and almost every Democrat is a pro-abortion candidate. So it's the kind of thing where they are not only not willing to draw the line, but they're willing to draw a line that excludes someone of my perspective. It says, "Oh, you're just a radical. You're a tinfoil hat guy. You're crazy, and you shouldn't even be speaking on these issues because you cause people spiritual trauma, as someone recently pointed out on
Yeah,
Twitter.
well, we were lumped in with a bunch of other people like Justin Peters and D.B. Harrison and I think John MacArthur, James
Hmm.
White, and quite a few others who are guilty of causing spiritual or inflicting spiritual violence and thus causing spiritual trauma.
Yeah.
Of course, I think that was the founder of Revoice, um, or the president of Revoice that said that. So I guess that's not surprising. I don't know why we should care what he thinks of us. Uh, but
Here's why we should care is because there
yeah,
are so many people in the
yeah,
middle that haven't decided yet. And the people that are the heads of the organizations, like Danny Akin, the president of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, or Russell Moore, they're platforming the people that are
yeah.
attacking
Well,
us.
and to get back to what you were talking about with voting Democrat, the like you pointed out, the number one problem with voting Democrat is that most Democrats are pro-abortion, right? And pretty rabidly so, not just tepidly a little pro-abortion. They're very pro-abortion nowadays. Uh, and one of the major reasons that most Christians cite for voting Democrat rather than Republican is going to be something like, well, Republicans are racist. And what they mean by that is this new definition of racism, where to vote against welfare is considered racist, or to
Mm-hmm.
not want to implement government policies in order to fix mere statistical disparities is racist. That's an absurd definition of racism. That like the Christians are pitting the failure to vote for fixing statistical disparities against killing babies. And they're saying that killing babies isn't as bad as not voting to fix statistical disparities. Like this is wicked and stupid. The idea that anybody could look at a mere statistical disparity and say that's racism, and it's so obviously racism, and it's so obviously the wicked type of racism that everybody has in mind when they think about racism, that we should vote for killing babies instead of voting for that. You've got to be a moron or extremely wicked in your heart to go through that line of reasoning. I mean, this is not difficult, and yet so many Christians reason that way, and
It's not just the 50 or so people that are on the board and on the council and whatever of each one of the organizations. It's most pastors across our country, uh, even in conservative churches, and very many people sitting in churches are being told that it's okay. It's okay to vote for
and
these
a lot of it is
policies.
because people are just not thinking, that they're emoting. They are feeling the pressure of the culture and the pressure of these leaders and the pressure of not wanting to be thought of as racist and insensitive. They're feeling all of that, and they are letting those feelings accumulate into ideological capitulation rather than stopping, shutting off your feelings for a second and thinking rationally, objectively, does this make sense? Is it true that voting for a Republican in this instance is racism or white supremacy? Is it true that voting against welfare is racism or white supremacy? And if that's not true, then what ought to be done about those Christians who are claiming that it is? The answer is church discipline. And then you get into an issue of courage or cowardice for pastors. Because any pastor who's come to that point of actually shutting down their feelings for a second and thinking rationally about this, if they've come to the realization that, okay, this is garbage, this is irrational, this is insane, then the question is, what are you going to do about it, pastor? Are you going to do what is just and right and in line with truth? Or are you going to ignore what you just discovered by thinking rationally and pretend that nothing's wrong? Because that's the next step.
Yeah. So the things that you and I are doing discussing this, writing about it, advocating that others do the same and support us and support others that are doing it. It's not just because we want to put somebody new in charge of the ERLC or that we want to shut the doors of the ERLC. Either one would be okay with me. It's not just that. It's our churches are preaching a lot of garbage and letting people believe a lot of garbage without ever teaching them the right way. And I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, millions of Christians in the United States who don't know how to think in principle about political issues, but moral issues as well. And it's spiritually dangerous. It's not just dangerous to the way that the United States is going to go downhill and what the legacy we're going to leave to our grandkids. It's dangerous because of, if in your heart you accept the things that are coming down the line in critical theory and oppression theory and everybody's a victim, that turns your heart wicked. So I think maybe, Jacob, let's talk about that. Spiritually, what is wrong with somebody who is today claiming that they need racial reparations because of what happened 152 years ago?
Oh man, where to start? So the first and most fundamental thing that's wrong with this whole ideology, whether you consider yourself a victim or whether you consider yourself a victimizer, the most fundamental thing is that there's no objective or rational basis for this ideology. It's all based in pure emotion and in pure emotional manipulation. And so if you're giving into, if you are switching off your mind in order to merely sympathize, in order to give in to the demands to think with your heart, to quote unquote just listen, which means shut up, don't ask questions, don't think critically, just accept what I'm saying to you. If you're willing to do that on this issue, that opens up the door for the enemy to get you to do that on every other issue down the line. And so, this will just be the first step. And this is one of the things that concerns me the most. If the enemy has been able to get a foothold in the church so thoroughly on this issue by mere emotional manipulation, which is what's going on, then how much more can the enemy flourish in the church on other issues? That is what should be mostly concerning to us. But then in addition to that, if you accept this ideology that says that the essence of justice is based in feelings, in sympathy, in how much sympathy someone can elicit from you. So it's only an injustice if it elicits a certain amount of sympathy. And you see this with the new definition of racism, where black people can't be racist against white people, and it's not viewed as an injustice because white people are quote-unquote privileged, and it doesn't evoke a sense of sympathy when you think about a white person being the victim of prejudice. That there's no sympathy to be had in the white person's victimology like there is in the person of color's victimology. And so this whole idea of justice and what counts as oppression and what doesn't, what counts as racism and what doesn't, is based off of sympathy rather than truth. If you adopt that, then ask yourself, what's the implication if we apply this to the justice of God and the gospel? Because God claims that we've committed a gross, massive injustice against him. But he doesn't suffer at all because of it. There's no sympathy that is evoked in our hearts when we think about God's being transgressed, when we think about his law being transgressed. He's not up in heaven suffering because of our injustice against him, because of our sin. He's perfectly fine without us. He doesn't need us not to sin. And so if you think that in order to take injustice seriously, there has to be some sort of sympathy attached to it, some sort of deep suffering attached to it, then you're going to be prone to think that our injustice against God isn't that big of a deal. Just like you're prone to think an injustice against a white person isn't that big of a deal because, oh, poor white person, you're not suffering nearly as much as a person of color. Well, that's going to translate into, oh, poor God, you're not suffering nearly as much as us humans. And this will issue very quickly into a denial of the justice of God and the gospel, which will issue very quickly into a denial of the gospel itself.
this idea of it's like an anti-value orientation, because what they're doing is they're saying that need and that suffering are the thing that matters, and therefore it's a sense of hating that which doesn't need
Mm-hmm.
or that isn't suffering, and feeling kind of an envy toward it, or a hatred of the good for being the good, is what Ayn Rand talked about. And we see that today so much when when people say we just need to just take as much as you can from the rich because they never earned it, or even if they did earn it, I don't care, I need it. That kind of attitude.
Yeah, it's at the very least, it's an indifference toward that which is not needy, that which is not weak, that which is not suffering, um, and that means that translates into an indifference to God. And so this whole uh,
Right.
oppression Olympics, victim mentality, it's all very nihilistic. It's all aimed at uh, deconstructing for the sake of deconstructing. There is no positive construction. There's no positive end or telos to it. There's not a positive vision to be constructed. It's all about tearing down that which is in order to make room for that which is not. And we mean that in the nihilistic sense, not in the temporal sense, the way the Bible talks about it.
Jacob, you and I have talked about this a lot, but there's something that you said a moment ago about need, and then the relationship between justice and need, that it never crossed my mind before. But what they are actually doing is they want to join those two concepts together, so that if there is a need, that
Yeah,
is an injustice, and that all injustice must be defined in reference to somebody else's needs. So this theory that they are using for political theory and social theory, it um, so it's the altruistic ethics, which says that others' needs are the standard of what is good.
yeah. So more than that, it rests on the foundation of need as such. And where does need come from in a biblical Christian worldview? Need comes from sin. The, us needing stuff comes from us being sinful. Need comes from that which is not holy and good and glorious and God centered. Need comes from that which is not God. And so, yes,
It's
exactly. So
privation.
this whole theory of justice, this whole system is based on nothingness, zero. That's why I call it nihilistic. It comes from the nihil, from the nothing. God created ex nihilo. God, in the Christian view, God always existed. He is I am, and and everything, including and especially justice, is based on His being, a positive value. Whereas this is based on the opposite, on the negation of value, on the nihil, on the nothing, on the zero, on that which is needy and suffering and lacking value. And that's where justice comes from. And we have no concept for justice apart from being needy, which is completely anti-Christian and anti-Bible. You cannot maintain a robust Christian theology, let alone the gospel, if you're going to allow this worldview into your thinking.
AKA Timothy Keller's
Yeah,
generous
that
justice,
that's the most
right?
explicit example.
So this egalitarian political ideal that says that differences in achievement or in economic outcome are an obvious sign of injustice, and that we need to raise up those at the bottom, even if it's at the expense of cutting down those at the top. It ends up being a worship of failure, and it ends up being a contest. And this is how you see it play out in people's attitudes and where it affects your soul. Is it becomes a contest to see who can be the most victimized in the most amount of ways, and that damages your ability to have self-worth and to have good relationships. Because if you go to somebody else on the basis of your need, you should be my friend because I need you to be, you should marry me because I need it, you're not going to get very much out of life.
Yeah, and like we pointed out earlier, if you go to God expecting that your need gives you a just claim against Him with this theory of justice, He's not going to be pleased. if you go to God expecting that your need of him gives you a just right to what you want from him, the Bible's pretty explicit that you are going to be turned away. You're going to be disappointed. God is not going to accept you. In fact, God will not accept you or fulfill any of your needs, no matter how much you need him, unless you fall on your face and relent of any rights that you might have before him, unless you confess that you don't deserve anything from him, unless you confess that justice would be him sending you to hell forever, giving you the opposite of what you need, unless you confess that that's what justice would be, and that what you need from him is emphatically not justice but grace, he will not give you an ounce of what you need. That's the Christian gospel.
Interestingly, Christianity has no place for an entitled attitude, the entitlement mentality. And it's my perspective that those who are buying into the oppression Olympics mindset, the critical race theory mindset, they are coming to everyone, their entire society, with an entitlement mentality. And it's not just on the basis of race. It could be a basis of anything that makes you distinct as a person, including your like, was your family poor or rich as you were raised? What was your educational attainment? Are you disabled or able-bodied? Are you young or old? How many languages do you speak? Which language? There's any number of things that you could, which gender are you, or sexuality? There's any number of things that the critical theorists are using to divide us, and that's where we get to the intersectional theory. The intersectional theory says that you can be a victim in like 17 ways at the same time, and that gives you more points. That's to reduce it to what it actually is. And you can see intersectional theory is the worship of either differences for the sake of differences, which is illogical, or the worship of failure or lack in some sense. Now, that doesn't apply to all the categories, because obviously there's no inherent superiority in male or female or in different races. But for some of those categories, ableism versus disabled, or for some of the other categories like sexual deviancy or poverty versus wealth, there obviously is a difference between attainment and failure. And what we have is a worship of failure or the worship of something that we perceive to cause us to fail.
And I think what you just mentioned is the important part. Even with those things that aren't about actual objective positive or negative value, they are perceived as positive or negative. Right? Male is perceived as positive, and thus is rejected as something that is evil, and femininity is perceived as something that is negative, and thus is embraced and enshrined as good. And it completely distorts a biblical anthropology. But more than that, what we're talking about is it's this whole idea that which is perceived as value-oriented and positive must be torn down for the sake of that which is perceived as negative or weakness-oriented or suffering-oriented. And like I said, this is going to breed in you a hatred for your fellow man to the extent that he is man, because man is better, more positive, value-oriented than beast, right? So the extent to which people are acting like human beings rather than like animals, it's going to breed in you a hatred for them, and it's going to breed in you a hatred for God, because God is infinitely more value and positive value-oriented than you are as a human being. And so this can only breed hatred and division. And it's brought in under the auspices of love and sympathy, but it only takes a couple seconds of rational analysis to realize this isn't the way to be loving. This isn't the way to sympathize. There's a better way. And it doesn't take much critical thinking to realize that. You just have to stop for a second and be committed to asking yourself, what's the truth of the matter? Forget about the way someone's going to feel about it. Forget about the way I'm going to feel about it for a second. Forget about the way the entire world is going to feel about it, what is the truth of the matter? And then you can be loving because you got the truth. You can be actually loving. You can actually fight racism and white supremacy and whatever else deserves to be fought.
Two thoughts came to my mind, and then I have a question for you. So the two thoughts were pertaining to this worship of the zero. One is this idea of the great reversal is present within Scripture. Of God has elevated his humble servant. You read Mary's Magnificat. I think it's in Luke 1 or 2 or something like that. And the fact is, there's many times when God turns the tables on people. He casts the riders into the sea, and he saves his people for his glory. But this theme of the great reversal has been seized upon by Christians that have already bought into the intersectional mindset and the worship of the zero. And you can see a perfect example of it if you ever happen to read Sally Lloyd Jones' Jesus Storybook, quote, Bible, which is not a Bible. It's hermeneutically deficient and devastatingly so. And it's also, it treats the main theme of the Bible as something that it, in fact, isn't. And the main theme is that we all just are running away from God, and that because we're afraid of him. But really, we just need to know that he loves us, and that's the answer to all of our problems. Is if we just knew that he loved us, and there's nothing in that storybook Bible about God's judgment or about hell, or even about what was the point of the cross. It's just this watered down version where basically every story has been recast to feature the minor characters. So the story of Jacob is actually now it's the story of Leah. And the story of Naaman, who gets healed, is now the story of Naaman's servant girl, who wasn't even named in the story, and maybe even like a totally made up character. I don't remember. But the idea is that these people that have built their whole worldview on what they got from the outside world, the intersectional theory and critical theory, they are trying to show you all of those ideas within the Bible. And they're willing to rewrite the Bible in order to accomplish it because they worship the zero to that degree. And then another thought about that, which is, it's funny, you can see this in politics if you ever pay much attention to what Democrats say. Jacob, what you were saying about the worship of the zero? Well, it's my perspective that the Democrat politicians, especially Hillary Clinton and that type, especially the ones that are old, rich, and white, they are the most racist people if you listen to them, and especially if you read some of their emails that came out that were exposed. They are so convinced that colored people or that whatever other kind of intersectional qualifier, that those people are inferior, that they put on everything they're doing is on the basis of their assumptions, their negative racist assumptions. And you can see it playing out in their policies. They treat people as if they were incompetent. And that's what socialistic policy does, is it treats people as if they needed a nursemaid. And it's insulting. And it's what affirmative action does, and it's not good. And that's the thing I wanted to pull out, is that this idea of egalitarianism, this leveling by tearing down the top and raising the bottom, it's not good for anyone. It hurts the top, but it also hurts the bottom in many ways. Not only that, but it's also morally unacceptable. All right, so those were the two ideas that I had about the worship of the zero. And I kind of lost track of what it was that I wanted to ask you. So I'm just going to turn back over to you.
How should we respond to people who use the great reversal theme in Scripture to justify their worship of the zero? Because that's an important question. So I would just say,
sure.
It's important to think about and ask, what is the purpose of this given theme in Scripture, or this given story, or this given passage, whatever the case is? Why does God commit this great reversal, or talk about this great reversal throughout Scripture when he does do so? And the answer, you'll find, is always in order to magnify his great work. It's always a positive value orientation. It's not worship of the zero like we've been talking about. It's not self-sacrifice or the negation of the strong for the end, as an end in itself, for its own sake. It's to knock down what is perceived as strong by sinful standards in order to highlight the magnificence and the glory of what is truly strong by divine standards. It's always to make a foil for the glory of God to shine more brightly, not to destroy as an end in itself, which is what this mindset of the worship of the zero and egalitarianism is. It's destruction for the sake of destruction. That there's a huge difference. And again, all that takes is asking a few critical questions. What's the purpose here? What is God trying to accomplish? What's the ultimate end? Right? So there's no rational justification for using the great reversal theme in Scripture in that egalitarian worship of the zero nihilistic fashion.
There's a really great article by Diane Gaskins at ourchristianintellectual.com/blog. And you can also find it because we republished it. It's at enemieswithinthechurch.com. It's the most recent article. If you click on the article section, it says in the media, and it'll take you to the articles. And she points out this presentation from Rebecca McLaughlin at the recent, I guess it was the TGC 2019 National Conference. And McLaughlin is a PhD that is, I think maybe she studied literature. I don't remember what it was, but she did a presentation for, at the same event that John Piper is speaking, and Mark Dever and all these other really well-known guys. Her presentation was Diane describes how McLaughlin basically calls Jesus a hero because he failed, because he was born poor, because he was brown-skinned, which is questionable but irrelevant, and immigrant, and all the just the cliches and bromides that you could ever imagine. But she only is willing to praise him because he happens to be an example of radical inclusivity. And it's that kind of person who they're bringing an outside standard, and then they're saying, well, we can accept Christianity because it belongs to our worldview. And they're the kind of people that eventually...
Finish your thought. I've got something. I'm angry. Finish your thought, though.
Well, once you read her articles, there's 2 of them, you'll be even more angry, but in a good way, because it's truth. So anyway, these people are eventually, if they follow that trajectory, a year from now, they're going to be the people calling Jesus a racist.
So let's back up. If the only reason, or even the main reason, that we ought to view Jesus as a hero and worship him is because he failed, because he sacrificed himself, that means that had he not done that, he would not be worthy of worship. That means that prior to doing that, he was not worthy of worship. And if he was not worthy of worship prior to sacrificing himself on the cross, then we weren't sinning in not worshiping him. And if we weren't sinning in not worshiping him, then there was no point in him coming to die on the cross. This completely undermines every single aspect of the gospel. This is absolutely asinine. And that other pastors and church leaders can't see this, or that they refuse to see it and refuse to speak out on it, is infuriating. This is disgusting. The gospel cannot survive. The gospel cannot stand if you think that Jesus was not worthy of worship apart from him sacrificing himself on the cross. That is so demonic. That is so disgusting. That is so nihilistic. That is so atheistic. I can't believe any Christian would teach that.
So we need to call out those Christian leaders who are, the bloggers at the Gospel Coalition, and the people that were brought in to speak. So Timothy Keller and John Piper, and Ligon Duncan, and Kevin DeYoung, Thabiti Anyabwile, and the Challies guy, was his name Tim, and Justin Taylor. All of these guys, when people believe the lies told by Rebecca McLaughlin and people go to hell, you will have blood on your hands. If you don't know what is being promoted at the conferences that you're speaking at, if you don't know that your name is being used to promote these lies, then you are not doing your due diligence. and you're a watchman asleep on the wall, and the blood will be on your hands. John Piper, I love you. The blood will be on your hands. You have to pay attention.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to read the articles yet or to read what McLaughlin said, but if all that is true, then you're absolutely right. Piper and anyone else who spoke at that conference, any organization that supports that conference, and every pastor who supports the conference or recommends the conference to other people, you are being negligent at the very least. You've got to take responsibility. Keep a close eye over your life and your doctrine. That includes the doctrine that you implicitly condone, that you implicitly put your weight behind and give credibility to.
It's pretty tragic. Sorry, I didn't mean to be such
That's
a
right.
downer.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the reality. We live in a hard world where there
Yeah,
is
we
truth or
can't pretend
consequences.
that everything's rosy and that there's never any danger to the gospel. It's typically the case that every generation there's a new threat to the gospel, that every generation there's a new threat to the church, that every generation there's a new threat to false teaching. And that doesn't mean that you should go out looking for it, but it does mean that you should be on the lookout for it, should it arise. And it does mean that you should be careful about what you recommend, be careful about what you implicitly endorse, and be careful to call it out when it does pop up. Be careful to not lead your people astray. Be careful to protect your people and the church at large from buying into these things that are contrary to the gospel.
At this point, the entire organization Together for the Gospel (TGC) is so completely, demonstrably sold out in this direction that you have to think about it like rat poison. A little bit that will kill you, mostly good stuff. I mean, I read things from TGC every once in a while that are
Sure.
fine. They have a lot of good stuff, but what are they accomplishing by bringing in all this evil stuff with the good stuff? And it could be more clear to me. End TGC, close the doors. That's a good rallying cry for if you're someone who cares about Christian discernment. It's time to start talking that way. Jacob, we'll wrap up our video, and I want to encourage anybody that's watching this, if you'd like to support the message that Jacob and I have and similar people, even a small donation is very helpful, and you can go to patreon.com/FTNCI, and you can find out about our project. And there are other people out there too that you should be supporting that are saying similar things, that honestly they just need a little bit of encouragement to know that the time that they're taking away from their other pursuits, that it's going to help somebody. And that's one of the best ways, is that you can help us with a donation,
Yeah.
or simply by praying for us.
Let
Pray
me
for our
tie
attitudes.
into what you just said there. So, yes, possibly it's time for TGC and organizations like that to close down, or it's time for those people to wake up. Ironically enough, to use language of being awake, it's time for them to wake up and to repent of pushing and allowing these false ideologies for so long, and to do what they've been so good at doing in the past with other issues, which is be faithful shepherds. They have it in them. They've done it before. They can do it again, and they're much more equipped than we are to do it. I would love for them to be the ones to do it, for them to reclaim their good name, and to wake up and be faithful shepherds, even at the end of their days. I would love that, and we should be praying for that. But as long as they don't do that, then pray for people like us, and do what you can to support people like us, because someone needs to be faithful, and I hope it's going to be those men.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's not, to the extent that it's not, it's got to be somebody else, and we're doing everything that we can to fill that void.
Well, Jacob, thank you for joining me today. And everyone, you're welcome to join us. We're going to attempt to do this every Tuesday at 9 Eastern, or 8 Central, or 6 Pacific. So look forward to seeing you
Yes,
then.
you too.
You have a good night.